Hello everyone and welcome back to Cine 104 History of Motion Pictures 1945 to present, and we are up to Class 8. Got some great stuff as we go through the 1970s and start creeping into the 1980s. More wonderful directors and actors and actresses, and let's get started. First off, right in the middle of this period, I wanted to remind us all that this is a period of the anti-hero. Movies have always had anti-heroes going back to film noir and so on. They've been around through the movies, especially in American films, but this is a real fertile period for the anti-hero. And if we look at this list of movies as we go through them, chock full of anti-heroes, Midnight Cowboy, Clockwork Orange. Some aren't very heroic at all, Alex and Clockwork Orange, really. And others a little less so. The Doctors and MASH are irreverent and anti-authority, but they are doctors and they are saving lives. Some a little less heroic than others, but this is really the era of the anti-hero. And the actors that are playing them, we are not getting the classic handsome, you might say, tall, fair, blonde, whatever, blue-eyed types that we see in Marvel movies and things like that. These guys are, as they were known back then, and it's sort of derogatory, really, ethnic. And that's sort of a code. A lot of them had Italian backgrounds, so they would have dark hair and dark eyes and not be as tall as others. So when we get actors like Al Pacino and Dustin Hoffman and people like that, it was sort of a code word, ethnic. It didn't really mean Latin or Hispanic or black or anything like that, but it was sort of a code back then that there were so many of these ethnic type actors. And I guess you could extend it really to Hispanic actors, dark hair, not so tall, dark eyes, all that sort of thing. And that would be a way that sometimes they might be described when they didn't want to use race or ethnicity. Ethnic. Okay, anyway, let's move on to another great anti-hero, Jack Nicholson. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest from 1975. And this is very definitely an allegory. We have an individual and his struggle against societal authority, and it is set inside a mental institution, and it's based on Ken Kesey's novel. Now, even though it's set in a mental institution, it could be set in all sorts of other places where we have individuals struggling against authority. It could be set in college. It could be set on a sports team. It could be set in a hospital. It could be set anywhere. And this is set in a mental institution in large part because the author of the book, Ken Kesey, as a young man worked. He wasn't a patient, but he worked in a mental institution. And while he was there, he actually volunteered for some drug tests. A lot of times they will do drug tests and things, psychotropic drugs and things like that. And way back in the early 60s, Ken Kesey was given under clinical medical supervision LSD. Which must have been pretty strange to be in some clinical white room, probably a chair and a table and all that, and not being told a whole lot, really, about what it was going to be, but tripping on acid, as the term used to be. And he became kind of a fan and managed to get a hold of some, and then as the 60s roared on, he became a big fan of LSD and put on acid trips and things like that for friends and acquaintances. Okay, from Ken Kesey's novel back to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. with Jack Nicholson. He is playing a somebody who really shouldn't be there, and while he was in regular prison for, I can't remember exactly what, he does seem to have anger issues, but it's not the sort that would need to be institutionalized. And he hears from people, we don't see this in the movie, we just hear about it a little bit, that instead of being out working in the hot sun, busting rocks or whatever he's doing, that those guys down the road there at the Cuckoo's Nest, as they say, the mental hospital, they just sit around and play cards all day. And what a great gig that would be. But you have to be crazy. So he acts out and pretends to be mentally unstable, I guess would be a good term. And so he does get himself committed to the mental hospital. But there are a couple of shocks for him in store when he gets to the mental hospital. First off is he thinks he's got 6 more months to go on his sentence, something like that, 6 months or so to go on his sentence. And now that he has been committed to a mental hospital, the only way to get out is when the doctors say you are ready to resume your role in society. You don't just do your time. The other shock to him is he meets the other men on the ward, lots of future stars to be, Danny DeVito and people like that, and Christopher Lloyd, doing a really wonderful job playing the patients. And they all complain, and he's kind of the alpha dog. He would probably be an alpha dog whether or not he was in a mental hospital, but he's kind of the alpha dog and is teaching them how to play poker and things like that. And he does some stuff that really he's not a medical professional. He thinks they seem quite normal, and all you need to do is get out and get some fresh air. And he commandeers a bus and takes them, instead of going on a field trip, he takes them out to a boat, and they all go fishing and so on. And he thinks that he knows what's best for them, but he really doesn't. He really doesn't. And these guys, they really do need mental care. And there's a young man there who is suicidal, and he really looks up to the Nicholson character. Randall Patrick McMurphy is his name, McMurphy, or Mac as they call him in the movie. And he thinks that just Billy Boy just needs to go out and the term get laid, right? Just get him out and meet some women and all that, and you'll just be fine. And your mother is overpowering you and all the whole rest of it. But like all the other men there, he really does need good medical help. So what he finds out about all these guys as they complain about the facility, and especially Big Nurse, as she's called, and she's really the other central character. There's a big butting of the heads with Nurse Ratched and McMurphy, and it's sort of a power dynamic, really, who's in charge and all of that. And they complain so much about her, and when I get out, I'm going to do this and so on. And he finds out again late in the movie that they are all in on their own, and anytime they want to leave, they can leave. They can leave. They are in because they know they need help. They or their loved ones know they need help, and they could leave the hospital anytime. And that's a big shock to him because he can't. And there's another patient, the Native American Indian Chief Bromden, whom they call Chief Broom, who seems to be deaf and dumb in that he doesn't speak, and it's hard to tell if he hears or not. There's a reveal. We will see a reveal. Spoiler, as one of the clips I've picked for you to see. Otherwise, aside from McMurphy and Chief Broom, all the rest of the guys could get out anytime they wanted to, and that's kind of shocking too. So some good scenes to watch. Really, the butting of heads, who's in charge here, and all of that. This is the first film since 1934 to win all of the top 5 Oscars. I'm not the one that chooses the top 5 Oscars. I guess that's something that just a consensus kind of formed. Film and director and script and actor and actress. I always think that cinematography and editing are top Oscars as well, but we are kind of a star-driven society. So these are the top 5 Oscars that have been chosen, and this is only the second one to win those since 1934's It Happened One Night, and it happens one more time with Silence of the Lambs, slasher movie from a few years after that. But it's only happened 3 times. Other movies have won more Oscars, including Lord of the Rings, and a number of other movies have won more Oscars, but not those top 5. So this one did that. Jack Nicholson had a pretty darn good decade in the 1970s that really made him a star. Easy Rider, not quite the 1970s, 1969, and The Shining from 1980, but that's a pretty good list of movies right there. Chinatown and The Last Detail, and he was nominated for awards and so on for all of those films, and went on through into the 90s and so on. He hasn't worked in a few years. He's probably in his 80s. Maybe if a really good script came along, he might go back on the screen. But he's still with us, thankfully. Quite a presence. But he hasn't done any acting in, I would say, 3 or 4 years now, and maybe he's just decided to sort of fade away quietly. I don't know. Anyway, a wonderful actor. He had a heck of a decade. He's won 2 or 3, I didn't even look it up. He's won 2 or 3 Oscars for acting. I think 2. But Jack Nicholson. Okay, speaking of Oscars, we have Network, and that's Peter Fincher there. He is the first actor to win an award for acting posthumously, which means after he has died. Heath Ledger also did that a few years ago as the Joker. This is Network from 1976, directed by Sidney Lumet, and he is part of the live TV generation. John Frankenheimer and Arthur Penn for Bonnie and Clyde. So a number of these directors came out of that live TV generation right before the more famous film school generation came out with Coppola and Lucas and Scorsese and Spielberg. But the live TV generation, they did pretty good as well. And this film is about network TV. Now, the networks used to be a really big deal in America. Before cable and the internet, most people got their news from television and newspapers, and even more people got their news from television than newspapers. So that was kind of a thing when it switched over to television. A script by Patty Chayefsky predicted so much, including angry newscasters. We have plenty of angry newscasters, especially on cable TV today, ranting and raving and so on the left and on the right. There are angry newscaster types, and this is way back in the 70s, kind of predicting all of that. And his cry of pain really is, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore. And that became kind of a thing back then. And he is the anchor of the 4th network at the time. That was the 4th network. And like I said, these anchors, of course, they were all white males. Of course, that's just the way things were back then. No surprise, really. And he starts having mental problems. And I kind of like showing this film right after One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest because they do link together in that way, mental problems. And he starts hearing voices and things, and possibly the Word of God, who knows. And he starts ranting on television. His best friend, another newscaster, really thinks he needs medical help, but a lady at the network, played by Faye Dunaway, who we know from Bonnie and Clyde and from Chinatown, thinks that people will tune in to watch this, and that's kind of what we get on not only news TV, but it's kind of what we get on reality shows. People addressing the camera in those little confessionals and breaking down and screaming and crying and all that sort of thing. And this movie did all that stuff way back 50 years before, 40, 45, 50 years before the confessionals and whatnot on the game shows and the competition shows and all of that. And so she wins out. It looks like he is a ratings hit with his rants and so on, and they leave him on the air, much to the consternation of his good friend. In addition, a sort of a prediction of the rise of multinational conglomerates, a wonderful scene, and I've linked to that one too, of the head of the network taking our angry newscaster, Howard Beale is the character's name in the movie, Howard Beale, and he takes him into the boardroom and tells him there are no governments, there are no countries, there are no borders, there are only conglomerates, giant multinational conglomerates that run the world. And the chemical companies and the oil companies and the automotive companies and all that. Now that's all well before we have Apple and Google and Facebook and Microsoft and all the whole rest of that. And he is predicting multinational conglomerates really before it was kind of a thing. So we get that. We get some reality TV stuff thrown in there as well. The crazy Faye Dunaway character decides at one point to send a film crew out to follow around some domestic terrorists. And there was a fair amount of domestic terrorism in the 1970s. Lots of radicals blowing up banks, usually when nobody was there. Usually they did it on the weekend or on the evening, but that was the radical point against conglomerates and that sort of thing. Every once in a while, there would be a guard or somebody would get killed. That wasn't their intent, but they were acting very, very radically and what they thought were blowing up buildings. But every once in a while, people would be involved, and they would be that would be manslaughter for sure. So they decide to follow around a crew of these domestic terrorists. One of the groups in real life were the Black Panthers. It sounds kind of weird now that we know the film Black Panther, the Marvel superhero, but there was a group of, not all, I wouldn't call them terrorists for the most part, possibly some offshoots or fringe types, but the Black Panther Party that began in Oakland, California, and they were militant. They thought that black people should carry guns and not be oppressed and so on. So that was the idea, right, to follow these people around as they hold up banks and that sort of thing, which sounds pretty crazy today. And so the movie is definitely a satire. It's very definitely a satire. But sometimes a satire like this, or like Dr. Strangelove, it's so close to reality that sometimes it's hard to tell. Is this funny or not? Is this supposed to be funny? It seems so real. And I mentioned, I know, with Dr. Strangelove, that the idea of the government officials hiding in a mine shaft, as Dr. Strangelove has his idea that they can hide in a mine shaft, that's actually has happened. They have hollowed out mountains, not mine shafts, but mountains in West Virginia. It's a real thing. It sounds ridiculous. It sounds far out and satire, but sometimes satire comes pretty close to the truth. And it sure did in a couple of those episodes, that's for sure. So we've been talking about some wonderful films here, these last few classes, including The Godfather and Chinatown and MASH and Clockwork Orange and Network and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, all these wonderful films. And they don't make movies like this anymore. And I'm not the one that came up with it, really. I read it and I thought that it sounded quite accurate and quite true to me. But mid-level movies, mid-budget movies with stars are rarely made. The example that is put out there of the kind of movies they don't make anymore is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Quentin Tarantino's film, two big stars, and DiCaprio and Pitt in a fairly good-sized budget of a movie, but it's not an action movie for the most part. It's not superheroes or fantasy or anything like that. It's really a drama or a comedy drama, and it would fit in with the kinds of movies from the 1970s, but those kinds of movies are rarer and rarer these days. The Chinatown type movies and Cuckoo's Nest type movies. And I see I've misspelled Cuckoo's Nest there, and Network and so on. So it has changed. The times have changed for that part. They still make those kinds of movies, but usually they're much lower budget type movies. Or they don't have the big stars. Not like the old days with De Niro and Pacino and Redford and Hoffman and Nicholson and all those guys. All right, we will lighten things up a little bit with Woody Allen. He has 50 or more films. It might be up to 55 films. Very prolific. Just about every year, a new Woody Allen movie comes out. And he is rare. I lump him in with, there are a number of other directors, but I especially lump him in with Clint Eastwood and the Coen brothers, in that they all work pretty fast. They all write and they all direct and all of that. And they win awards and keep their budgets very low. So they are fast and cheap and in control. And Clint Eastwood, he's probably got 50-some movies. The Coen brothers, they're not quite that old, but they, for a while, were getting a movie out about every couple of years or so, every 18 months or so. And that is a kind of a rarity in Hollywood. Hollywood seems to like that. It doesn't cost a lot. It's like asking your friend for $10. Most people say, sure, here's 10. A lot of people might not say, can I have 100? Okay, that seems like quite a bit of money to a lot of us. But 10, sure, I can loan you $10. And that's kind of what's going on with the movies. When a director like Woody or Clint or the Coen brothers say, can we have $25 or $30 million to make a movie? And to the studios, that's like asking for, $10. It's not really a whole lot. So they get to direct, often write, and have final cut. And we will talk about that some more when we get up to the Coen brothers, what final cut is all about. So a lot of, back to Woody, a lot of actors with Oscar nominations. A lot of actors like to be nominated. They like to know they're working with a quality director and a quality script and so on. 24 more than anybody else. And I would guess Spielberg's pretty darn close. I'd have to say. I haven't done a lot of research on who's got the most nominations and so on. But for writing, Woody has definitely the most. And Tarantino's coming along pretty fast on the writing, but he doesn't pop those movies out every 2 years or so. So the movie that put Woody on, Woody's trajectory, he was a writer. He began as a writer on television back in the 1950s, and then he transitioned into stand-up comedy and was pretty successful at that, very successful at stand-up comedy. And then he got into movies, writing scripts for movies, a couple of movies, and then he decided he wanted to direct the scripts on his own movies. A lot of writers think that they probably could do a better job of directing their own scripts, maybe than other directors. This goes back to like Preston Sturges back in the 1940s, and yeah, a number of. Let me see here. Who's that director? Anyway, I'm drawing a blank on a couple of other directors who started as writers and decided they wanted to do some directing and so on. And there have been a number. So Woody got a chance to do that. He started off directing funny, kind of slapstick type movies, and then he got a little bit more serious as he went along. Annie Hall from 1977 really was a turning point for him. He won Best Picture and Director and Actress, not Best Actor. So he didn't direct himself to an Oscar, so he didn't win the top 5. And the screenplay, there he is with Diane Keaton, who won the Best Actress, and she is wearing kind of her own outfit, and the man's pants loose, loose pants and a tie and a vest and all that, and yet still being fairly feminine looking, and that became a thing, and lots of young women decided that they wanted to emulate that look, so that became a little bit of a thing for the look. And so this film was about the writer, played by Woody Allen, and all of the girls that he was dating, and his act and stand-up comedy and all the whole rest of it. And the initial cut of the movie was, I don't know, like 4 hours long, something like that. And he knew he couldn't do that. He knew he couldn't have a movie that long. So the more they whittled the movie down, and whittled it down and whittled it down, they started seeing that the part centering on Annie was really the best part of the movie. Billy Wilder, that was driving me nuts. I'm so sorry. Billy Wilder was the director who was a writer and wanted to do some directing. So anyway, there you go. Didn't have to stop and look it up. I was pretty sure my brain would get it at some point. Okay. Anyway, back to Annie Hall and Diane Keaton and Woody Allen. They whittled it down and whittled it down, and they were pretty experimental in this movie, and I think that's what really holds up so well. It's a well done movie, but it's very experimental, and that fits in quite nicely with the 1970s. It breaks the fourth wall, a direct address of the camera. It is nonlinear, it jumps around a little bit in time from the beginning of their relationship to the middle, to the end, and back to the beginning again. There are thought subtitles. I've linked to a bunch of these scenes, by the way, so as you explore around, if you choose to watch it, it's a fantastic movie. It's only about 90 minutes, and they really pack a lot into it. But if not, I've linked to a lot of this stuff with the subtitles. They turn into animated characters briefly. There are split screens in the movie where the people on one side of the split screen talk to the people on the other side of the split screen. In a wonderful scene in a flashback, which I've linked to because it's so hilarious, he appears with his young self in, I don't know, maybe the 4th grade, something like that, and as an adult, talking to the teacher and so on in that flashback. There's voiceover. At one point, the actors leave their bodies to appear as ghosts. He and his girlfriend are sort of going through the motions, so their bodies are in bed, but they sort of leave their bodies and grab a chair and start talking and doing other things. Nicely done, a way to sort of show, you're not really into it. You're sort of going through the motions. Anyway, very creative, witty, and very prolific. And 1977 was a big year. That's the year Star Wars came out, and Close Encounters and some other movies. But this one really did capture the 1970s, I think, in a pretty good way. And it does hold up. And I don't think there are very many people thinking that they really need to change their vote or anything like that. It holds up quite well. So as I mentioned, Woody had a lot of movies out. These are just a few of the 50 or so. Sleeper and Bananas are very funny. They're almost like slapstick. It's almost like Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton type movies. And then after Annie Hall, more still comedies, but not surreal type comedies and things like that. And like I said, Annie was kind of a transition. It's a little wacky with turning into animation and that sort of thing, but it's definitely more grounded than Sleeper and Bananas and Take the Money and Run and some of his earlier movies. A lot of his movies for a while were set in his native New York. He grew up in Brooklyn and moved to Manhattan. He made the movie Manhattan in black and white, and at some point I will talk about all the many directors, award-winning directors, Oscar-winning directors who have worked in black and white. And Woody, for sure, with Manhattan, it's a gorgeous-looking movie. But a lot of his movies were set in his hometown of New York or Manhattan. Even some of the movies that are set in the past, like Radio Days, is set in the 1940s when he was a kid. But it's in Brooklyn, New York, so even that. Lately, he's been filming in London for a while, and a couple of movies in Paris, and a couple of movies in Rome. So Midnight in Paris was shot in Paris. It looks fantastic. He makes Paris look every bit as gorgeous and beautiful and romantic as Manhattan or London or Rome or any of that. Most of his movies are romantic comedies. Yeah, I would say romantic comedies, and some are a little bit more slapsticky. Bullets Over Broadway, about a gangster who's working on a script for a Broadway show, things like that. Lots of actors and actresses winning Oscars. Up into the pretty recent past, Blue Jasmine for Cate Blanchett, Midnight in Paris with a script, and so on. So from the 1970s to the 2010s, he's been turning out high-quality product and winning lots of awards. So throughout this whole period of Godfathers and Chinatowns and Cuckoo's Nests and so on, you might be thinking, hey, where are all the black people? And you would be right. Where are all the black people? And I hate to just blame it on that's the way it was, but that's the way it was. It was really hard for black people to get enough money from major studios to make a mid-sized budgeted film. There were a few stars that could do that. Sidney Poitier, every once in a while, Bill Cosby, sometimes could manage to get enough money for movies, things like that, when he was a star. But for the most part, blacks were relegated to servile positions, maids and butlers and things like that, and then even into the 1970s, bad guys and that sort of thing, or drug dealers or whatnot. But this subgenre came out, blaxploitation, black plus exploitation. It's not, I can't really say, and I don't think very many people even today think that these movies are exploiting blacks, but the name kind of stuck. Everybody knew what they were getting when they went in. They were getting their money's worth for sure. And they are a lot of fun. They really are. And when there was so much of the anti-heroes and sort of downer endings and things like that, these guys actually got to star in the movie. They won. And it was a kind of a big moment for the black audience to be able to go to these movies and see people like them. And I mentioned a little while ago that when Easy Rider came out, for young people, young college-age people or high school people, to go and see Easy Rider with long hair and smoking pot and all that sort of thing, that it was kind of amazing to see people that looked like them. Mostly, you didn't see that sort of thing in movies on the big screen. You knew it was going on, but up on the screen, Hollywood wasn't really showing that. And here we are a few years later, really just a few years later, and a whole different segment of society is seeing people that were like them, that looked like them. Not always. A lot of these guys, unfortunately, were transgressive heroes, pimps and drug dealers and the like. Shaft was a detective, but Superfly, Priest, was a drug dealer, and so on. So that is not it's not really the best way to portray your people, your race, I guess, if you're going to extend it that far. But on the other hand, they are the stars, and a lot of people, a lot of actors will tell you just being on the screen is a good thing, and even being the villain is fine. A lot of times the roles of the villains or the bad people are the best roles. The roles for saintly do-gooder people usually are kind of boring. And so these guys, these detectives and these whatever drug dealers, and they weren't all drug dealers and so on. It really got extended quite far. One of my favorites, Blackula. Okay, we have black vampires. So cool stuff, really a lot of fun. And the documentary that I usually show in class, amazingly, the entire documentary is available on YouTube. Normally I show about the first 25 minutes or so of the film, of the documentary, and you can watch as little or as much of it as you want, but in class I would show about the first 25 or 28 minutes or so of the film, or of the documentary, I should say. One of the ones in the documentary, Superfly, the soundtrack is by Curtis Mayfield, and it's very interesting, and it's commented on in the documentary that it refutes the entire movie. And so I've linked to 3 songs from the film: Freddy's Dead, Little Child Running Wild, and Pusher Man. And it's old school funk, wonderful stuff. I love it, love the album, loved it when I saw it in theaters way back when. So you can make up your own mind, but they are songs from in the movie. As a matter of fact, there's a scene in the movie where Curtis Mayfield and his band are playing in a nightclub, and we get to see him perform a little bit. They don't let him do the whole song, but we get to see him perform a minute or two of Pusher Man, I believe. And like I say, I've linked to a couple of those from YouTube. You can watch them and get into some old school funk. Also part of this is Pam Grier. We actually have a female action star, and she was the pretty much the lone blaxploitation female star, and she does great work. Quentin Tarantino is a big fan. He features prominently in the documentary, and he used her in Jackie Brown. And she has good insight. She has really good insight into the whole thing, and she's in the documentary too. So, good old Pam Grier. Next up, we have Terry Gilliam, and he is a director of animation, or he started in animation. Sorry, he started in animation in America. And he got hooked up with a British comedy troupe called Monty Python's Flying Circus, and there they are, there as various knights, members of, and that's Terry Gilliam right there. He doesn't have much of a role. He wasn't really an actor, but he did animations and things, this sort of stuff here, animations and so on. And so he was the lone American on the show. The show migrated to America and became a big hit a couple years after it was on in Britain, and they figured with an American audience they could start making some movies. So I have linked to Monty Python and the Holy Grail. That's the one that we would watch in class. Sometimes I forget myself, and we'd watch lots and lots of it because it's so hilarious. You will love it. It's the movie that when I was in college was a pretty big thing, and lots of people were were watching Monty Python movies and Monty Python the Holy Grail. And Terry Gilliam was the co-director of this film. I've linked to some wonderful bits in there, and you can watch as little or as much of it as you like. I usually have a lot of students that watch the entire movie for one of their papers because of the clips that I show in class. Some other films that Terry has directed over the years: Monty Python the Holy Grail, Time Bandits, which I understand is being turned into a TV series. I don't know where, Netflix or something, but I'm looking forward to that. Brazil, Adventures of Baron Munchausen, and there's the poster there. Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus. I think I've linked to that trailer. Terry began in animation, so his movies have a very interesting look to them, and there are a number of directors, and I love the way their movies look. Ridley Scott movies always look good, even if I'm not crazy about the movie, and the same thing for Terry Gilliam. His movies look fantastic. Some of the movies I'm not so crazy about, but they look just fantastic as well. And a lot of fun. So think about checking out anything by Terry Gilliam, especially really Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Yeah, Time Bandits, Brazil. They're all good. They're all good. Check any one of them out. That's for sure. And we have Brian DePalma. I think he's our last director today. Yes, I think he's our last director today. He is from the film school generation, along with Coppola and Scorsese and Lucas and those guys. And like Steven Spielberg in particular, and a lot of other directors really too, he manages to sort of emulate a heroic director like Alfred Hitchcock, but put his own spin on it. So he is often, especially in the early part of his career, referred to as Hitchcockian. Voyeurism, set pieces, thrills and suspense, not slasher, psycho stuff, but split screens, tracking, that sort of thing, heists and so on. The clip from Femme Fatale really encapsulates a lot of it, and that's why I linked to that. And the entire heist at a film festival is it's linked to. Okay, so you can see how he would get asked to direct more mainstream type films, and so he's got some personal films: Dress to Kill, Blowout, Body Double, and Femme Fatale. And I think I did this with Steven Spielberg with some personal films and some studio type films, and the same thing goes for Brian DePalma. His studio type films: Scarface, The Untouchables, Mission Impossible. You can see his touch, right? Like I say, his with the tracking shots and all that sort of thing. And you'll see it in Body Double, and you can see in some of these other movies the set piece in The Untouchables is quite nice. Shootout on the stairway at the train station, things like that. And even I think it's the very first Mission Impossible movie, and he seems to be a natural fit for that as well. And one more film. Sorry, I do have one more film. All the President's Men from 1976. The kind of movie they don't make anymore. These were two very big stars back in the 1970s, Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. Dustin Hoffman from The Graduate, of course, and Robert Redford, the founder of the Sundance Film Festival and the Sundance Institute, and so on. Both still working. They're in their 70s, creeping in on 80 even, but they are both still working. But they were Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio, really. In the 1970s, if you wanted Brad Pitt, you could get Robert Redford, and if you wanted Leo, you could get Dustin. And that's the kind of movie. They're not making so much like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's not quite the funny movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but this one is about the Watergate break-in and cover-up. Watergate was a office building with some apartments and things, and it was broken into by some people trying to re-elect President Nixon. Very stupid crime because Nixon was fairly popular and didn't really need any help to win that election in 1972 against George McGovern. He was way ahead. The war was kind of sort of winding down. The economy was okay. Really didn't need any help. Poor Nixon. In 1960, he probably could have used some help against Kennedy. It was a very close loss. And in 1968, it was a very close win for him against Hubert Humphrey. Those were very, very close elections, both of them. This one in 1972 was not a close election at all. They didn't need any help. They didn't need to bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters or anything like that. But some ill-advised people went in, they bugged it, took some photos, got caught by the night watchman, and it took about a year to unravel, about a whole year to unravel. But as the money was traced and there were inside people giving information to the reporters, the payoff money led up to the White House, led all the way up to the White House. So we have government corruption at the highest levels, and we're talking about this period, late 60s and early 70s. Don't trust authority, anti-authority, all of that, and this really put the final seal on all of that with corruption at government and so on. So that is All the President's Men. Again, kind of a rare movie, big budget movie, but not an action or superhero or anything like that. And that takes us to the end of Class 8. And that's pretty much exactly what it looks like right now, sitting at my desk, narrating into my computer there on the desktop. Class 9, more good stuff as we get in. We will be coming up on some really interesting films. We have Vietnam War films coming up very soon with Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket. We have Ridley Scott with Alien and Blade Runner. Some more good stuff coming up. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching. See you next week.